Hello and welcome to this Q&A from the Fertility Alliance. Today we're talking about the path to parenthood as a trans man, and we're joined by Freddie McConnell. So Freddie, welcome and thanks for joining us. I wondered if you
Thanks
could
for having
start
me.
by telling us a bit about your own route to parenthood.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite a long journey, I guess. I'm never really sure where to start. I mean, I guess I came out as trans and when I was at university, so sort of in my mid 20s, and that coincided with the dawn of YouTube and that sort of thing. So that certainly isn't the first time when I felt like I was different or that I there was something about me that sort of made life particularly difficult. That was just the first time that I had access to that language and those ideas. So yeah, I came out. Wasn't able to start my medical transition until I'd moved home after graduating. So yeah, I was sort of 25 by that point. Um, and part of the process of starting testosterone, certainly back then, I think it's slightly better now, but I still think there's a massive lack of information out there. Part of that was a conversation about fertility, which was basically just as much as you will not be fertile. This is it. You've got to make a decision now, and the options are either you can't transition or you can transition and freeze your eggs. And there wasn't really much conversation about then what would happen to those eggs in future. Certainly wasn't a conversation about you could then be pregnant using those eggs. That certainly wasn't an option. But genuinely, I can't think of anything that was discussed beyond just freezing your eggs and then I guess dot dot dot. I couldn't afford to do that, and it was put to me also pretty bluntly that they wouldn't be funded on the NHS. So I just didn't really. I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I will cross that bridge when I come to it. I did always think I would like to be a parent. That's something that I've felt sort of quite deeply from a very young age, and I've always really enjoyed the company of kids and babies, and sort of had an affinity. I was used to babysit when I was younger and that kind of thing. So um, I felt a bit uncomfortable just putting it to the back of my mind, and I know certainly my mum did as well. My mum is a huge ally and a great supporter of me through this whole process, and yeah, it was just this like slightly uncomfortable, heavy thing that just felt like it was being pushed away into the distance. Um, but certainly with the sort of knowing that it just might not ever happen, or probably wouldn't ever happen. Yeah, in any way, I guess. Like, yeah, whether it was like surrogacy, like I just didn't really know what my options were back then. What felt important was getting on the path of transition because like I didn't really feel like my life could begin until I was doing that, and like I wasn't really going to be looking. I needed to look after myself before I could think about anything else. So yeah, then I got my first proper job. Like my career started. Like life did really feel like it began. In that way that sometimes could be a bit late for LGBTQ people. But yeah, everything was great. And then a few years in, I came across a YouTube video of a trans man in America who was actually pregnant, and he'd been on testosterone. He had actually gotten pregnant without planning it with his cis male partner, which I think is, well, I know is like not uncommon for trans men. Maybe if their testosterone dose isn't quite right for them. Yeah, it happens. It happens a fair amount, and but he was pregnant. He was gonna, keep it, and he was like, it was all fine. His doctors were not concerned about anything. He'd stopped his testosterone as soon as he found out he was pregnant, and he was really happy about it as well, which I just found very confusing and sort of shocking and scandalizing to begin with. And but also so deep seated part of me was like, what? And also a bit angry because I'd been told that this wasn't possible. So I immediately felt like I'd been misinformed, and maybe I need to go back to my doctor and say, what's this? And but yeah, I didn't act on it straight away. I just sort of sat with it for a while, and it probably was about a year afterwards. I found some other guys who were going through a similar thing, some of whom had actually, conceived in a planned way. Just realized there was a lot more information out there than I'd ever known within the community, at least, certainly not within the NHS or sort of the medical field. And yeah, about a year later, I sort of thought, actually, if I am going to become a parent, this is the way I think I'll do it, because it's well, yeah, that might be your next. People always want to know, why did you choose this path?
That is what I was going to
Yeah.
ask you. I was going to ask
Mm,
you how difficult a thing it was to consider even the idea of pregnancy as a man.
mm. I mean, it was as new to me. It was as novel an idea to me as it would be to anyone. I would say when I first encountered it, because I had just genuinely did not think it was physically possible. I'd never had any information to suggest that it would be, or any examples of you know why you would consider that. I think, yeah, again, I think things are a little bit more flexible now, but we're talking, this is like 2013, when I ish 2012, 13, 14, when I was early on in my transition. And you go to the gender clinic, the NHS gender clinic, and it's sort of very much like you're presented with two options, a very kind of binary system. And if you're gonna, quote unquote, become a man, you have to do this. And so if you express any desire for children, that's a taboo. And it's a taboo for men in general, right, to sort of express that, like, that's important to you. Or the idea that men can feel broody, which I totally think they can now. Like, and I've had men of all kinds say that to me, sometimes in a slightly kind of furtive, whispering way. So I think if I'd have let myself express my desire to be a parent more fully back when I was sort of first being prescribed testosterone, I I think genuinely I would have been stopped, maybe, or it would have complicated that path. And even if it hadn't, I was so worried that it would, that I wouldn't going to take that risk. So I had a lot of work to do within myself to unpick all of that internalized, sort of all sorts of, what is it, sort of transphobia, binary thinking, sort of bit of, well, a bit of like sexism and misogyny around the idea of like what a woman is and what a woman's purpose is versus what a man's purpose is, and all this sort of essentialism. And I just, yeah, I think, and there also, once I was already transitioning, I did have this massive sort of blooming of confidence and understanding of myself as like, well, testosterone is important to me, transition is important to me, but they're not what actually make me who I am. So if nothing can make me not trans, nothing can, you know, I just, everything made a lot more sense once I was transitioned, or once I was being read and living as a man. So, because another thing people wonder is like, well, why would you go through all this and then just do this really kind of, quote unquote, female thing? And it's like, well, if you're a woman, it is a female thing. If you're not, then it's not. It's a trans thing. It's my thing. It's an individual thing, which I think anyone who's been pregnant would say it's a really individual experience, right? So I had to understand myself, feel comfortable in my own skin, be like, grow up a bit, so in order to decide what I wanted, or realize what I wanted. And so actually I couldn't have done any of this without transition. The idea of sort of living as a woman, and the dysphoria and the confusion, just like, and then getting pregnant with that, like, that's, I cannot, yeah, I can't even imagine. So it was just sort of, and then there's the practical side of it, I guess. When I was thinking more about parenthood and family, I did learn a lot more about the options and surrogacy and, adoption, all sorts of things. And ultimately, I felt like being able to be pregnant myself, and it sort of gave me a control over it. I wouldn't be subject to other people's opinions. Sort of, I would, but not in a kind of way that really ultimately mattered or had any bearing on the actual process or my ability to have a child. It was, so yeah, it was private. It felt safer, strangely. That might sound weird because I'm like, vulnerable as a pregnant man out in the world, but I knew I had a strong support system around me and people who would protect me. And I live in a small town, all these, there was a documentary that came out that we made about that time in my life, but it came out deliberately. That wasn't released until a year after I actually had given birth. So yeah, and also, it's one of those things that's sort of like, not a question you would ask anyone else, or that it's sort of appropriate, considered appropriate to ask other people, well, why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that? Well, frankly, I didn't adopt because I didn't want to. And if you don't want to adopt, then you better not do it, because it's an incredibly challenging and, it's a specific experience that people who where it's successful, people go into it with that real urge to do that specifically, right? And I will hold my hands up and say I don't think I have that in me, and I wouldn't want to sort of, yeah, I think seeing that as a sort of consolation or a and obviously for some people it is something that they look to once they realize that they don't have another choice. um and I'm not saying that they are going to be worse parents for that, but that isn't something I had to do. And yeah, it didn't really. And surrogacy, incredibly expensive, and very, very hard to make happen in this country because it's not regulated or properly, what is it, sort of, it's not, it's legal, but it's not, there's not a sort of proper way of doing it in the way that there is in other countries, right? Like, you're not going to get arrested, but it's certainly not sort of, what's the word? Yeah, it's still massively taboo, which I don't, it shouldn't be at all. But yeah, so the idea that any of those other options are sort of simpler, or I think it does a disservice to adoption, and it sort of it misunderstands actually the status of surrogacy in this country, at least. So yeah, funny, and now having been pregnant, I it was a incredibly it was an amazing experience in some ways, a very difficult thing in some ways, but the giving birth, just I feel so lucky to have had that experience in the way that I did. Wouldn't change that for anything. The idea of sort of choosing something else because what, like, male trans pregnancy is weird, like, doesn't feel weird when you're doing it, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, how did you then go about
Mm,
the process and how was actually being pregnant for you? How was that?
mm. Um, well, so God, it's like a while ago now. I have to sort of really go back in time in my head to think. I went to a fertility clinic and had some checks, like some, and I'd already actually spoken to my endocrinologist, who had looked after some trans men and non-binary people who'd been pregnant. So I was very lucky to have him to go to. And so he'd already sort of reassured me about how basically straightforward it is. I just needed to stop testosterone, and as long as I didn't have other fertility issues, which obviously you can do and many people do, then my transness or the testosterone, like that in and of itself, wouldn't have any impact as long as it cleared my system. And even if it hadn't cleared my system, because as I said, some trans men fall pregnant when they're on testosterone, and as long as they stop it straight away, then it's not shown, as far as I'm aware, to cause any issues. So I sort of had a sense that things would be okay. And then I went to a fertility clinic. They did some checks. Again, they said, yep, everything seems fine. Just stop testosterone. Wait for your cycle to return. Come and see us when that's happened. Happened fairly quickly, I would say, maybe 3 or 4 months of not taking monthly shots as I was then. How long that takes is so personal, depending on the person's system and body, and also what kind of testosterone they're on, whether it's short acting or longer acting. And then, yeah, chose a sperm donor through the London Sperm Bank. Didn't put massive amount of thought into that, in the sense that I didn't want to treat it like I was shopping or sort of trying to engineer a particular kind of person or child, which is like how it's depicted in like popular culture often, right? And I just, as soon as I was doing it, I thought, I'm gonna go off the vibes, which might sound weird, but like that is kind of what we do when you have a partner, right? Like, so yeah, just someone who just felt like, this person seems cool, like, yeah. Not that there's a lot of choice also, which is kind of another issue, but yeah. And then I just did IUI because I didn't have any other fertility issues, so it was relatively affordable. I was, paying for it myself. Very lucky that I didn't have to go through any more involved treatment, because I wouldn't have been able to afford that. And then, yeah, it worked. What was it? I only had to do 2 rounds of IUI. So yeah, when I say there really wasn't any issues and it was like straightforward, like, I really, yeah, that is just absolutely the truth. So yeah, I can't remember the other half of your question. Oh yes, how did it? I mean, being off testosterone was hard. I felt like I was going backwards. I've had wow, just all the comfort and like um what is it? Yeah, the comfort I felt in being myself. It's hard to dysphoria is really notoriously hard to explain and put into words. Basically impossible. So I suppose I won't try. But well, I did once hear someone say that it's a cosmic toothache or like an existential toothache, which I think is actually kind of an amazing way of describing it because it's like constant nagging something um, that was there, and I felt quite sick, and but actually being pregnant helped because it was that's what I was doing it for. I just had this thing that I think I know a lot of people do struggle, or or cis or trans. If you're trying to conceive, it's trying to conceive is hard. It's incredibly stressful if you're having, especially if you're having to have some other intervention. Um, it's the waiting. Oh, it's like a mental. It's sort of mental torture. I think in a lot of ways. So actually, sort of getting to that point of being pregnant was yeah mentally much easier. And then I carried small. I wore baggy clothes, and I was literally never read as pregnant while I was pregnant. So I felt quite safe. I mean, I was down. I don't think I was a very easy person to be around during that time. But yeah, it was, and a lot of that is the social side of it. I think I did feel physically like I wasn't comfortable, and nothing could have really made that any better. But it would have certainly been easier if I'd have had more spaces to be in that were trans inclusive. If pregnancy itself as an experience wasn't so overtly unnecessarily gendered, um, not just for in a female way but in a feminine way, which again bears saying that I think a lot of cis women would prefer that it wasn't as well, because what is that about? Like why so that made it hard. But I had a midwife who would come and visit me at home, for instance, and who was someone that I sort of knew from the community, from just locally, like a friend of a friend. So that made me feel safe. And this was pre-COVID as well, so I was able to plan the birth that I really wanted, and I didn't have any complications. I just got so lucky on so many levels with the actual pregnancy experience, first time around at least, that yeah. I only had one negative experience actually with in a healthcare setting, which I don't know if that's sort of explained a bit more about that, if that would be useful, because I know a lot of people have more negative experiences, like maybe they don't get to have their midwife appointments at home, or they might get passed around and they have to keep explaining their situation to different people. Like I just didn't have that. There was a continuity of care, which is so important for everyone, but especially if you've got like other stuff going on with who you are, and but then one time I had to go to a growth scan, an unplanned one, fairly late on. So my midwife wasn't around, and I had to go to the local hospital by myself. I think for some reason, I didn't have anyone to go with me. So when I got to the hospital, I checked in, and then the receptionist was already a bit like, "What?" So no one had been able to lay the ground for me a little bit before I got there, which is what my midwife had been doing. And I'd had a great experience going for a scan at a different local hospital with a queer sonographer who was just so lovely, and I'll never forget her. But this time that none of that had happened, so I could tell immediately that no one knew what was going on. And the receptionist handed me a big orange card, like A4 laminated card, that said something like ultrasound on it, which I guess is just how they I don't know, made it easier for the nurses to recognize who was having an ultrasound. But like it felt like someone had given me a target to hold. And I've been since, and that doesn't happen anymore, I'm pleased to say. But so I was in the very busy waiting room holding this laminated thing, and a nurse came up to me and sort of, I stood up to meet her because I was so aware of how vulnerable I was in that situation, and I didn't, want anyone to know, or for it to feel any more hostile or difficult than it already did. And So I stood up to meet this person because I could see she was coming towards me, and I just wanted to like, for us both to then move out of that room as quickly as possible. But she stopped and just was like, "Why are you holding that sign?" So it just went from like bad to worse so quickly, and I was like, I tried to explain it, and she just, I can't remember the next bit of the exchange, but after maybe 10 seconds, she just said, "Well, wait here," and marched off again. And I just like sank down into my seat, and everyone was looking at me. It was so bad. And then the whole appointment just went really bad because I was there because someone had sort of flagged something maybe was a bit complicated with my baby's growth, but all I could think about was I need to get out of here as quickly as possible. I should have been thinking about my baby, and I was just so bad. But yeah, a one-off experience of like a total nightmare in this otherwise very lovely, caring experience. So yeah, it just shows how easy it is to get it right, and also how badly wrong it can go as soon as that support network just disappears.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually, isn't it? And that you did have so much support and that you did have such a positive time for so much of that experience. I wanted
Mm.
to ask you about the stopping testosterone thing, because obviously that worked for you and you've got quite a lot of anecdotal evidence about it working for other people. But is there actually any evidence about, how long you have to stop or whether it always does restore fertility?
There is one study that I'm aware of. It's I don't know, maybe 10 years old now. It was in the US. All the research about this, as far as I'm aware, happens in the US. They've got a couple of centers of excellence. I think one's at Rutgers University, that are sort of very long standing, and we just don't have anything like that in the UK. We didn't, because of a sort of lack of awareness, and now I feel like we don't, partly because of a remaining lack of awareness, but also because of the political climate in this country, sadly, and there's sort of anti-trans rhetoric that's taken over, and is persisting with this government somehow. But yes, so there is some evidence. The study that I'm referring to, it's small, but it showed that there was no difference in the fertility of a cohort of cis women and a cohort of trans men who'd been on testosterone and had stopped. So the fertility outcomes were comparable. And which obviously means, like I say, there was fertility issues in both groups, but they weren't related to. Well, it didn't seem as though in the group of trans people that it was related to their transition, their medical transition. Um, and yes, the endocrinologist that I've spoken to, more than one, and other things I've read, what they would say is they don't understand. There is no obvious mechanism for why testosterone specifically. Obviously, if you have a hysterectomy and you don't have your reproductive organs anymore, you are not going to be able to have a baby. But testosterone itself, there's no mechanism of like interaction where damage or harm would occur. Um, Obviously, we all have a small amount of testosterone in our body, and yeah, so that was really interesting for me. It's not like, oh, there is this harm that we thought would occur. I think a lot of doctors just sort of thought about the process that they thought about the situation for trans women who are maybe taking estrogen and the impact that can have on sperm production, which is different, and there are known, there are reasons for trans women to think about fertility preservation, absolutely, although it's also not as black and white as it's been presented in the past. I now understand, but I think that understanding was just sort of transposed onto trans men and people with ovaries and uteruses, and it was like, well, yeah, we know that now. Great, we can just assume. In fact, no research or study was done on it. And what I say, I don't go out there and say there isn't that it's been we know that testosterone doesn't harm trans male fertility. What I say is that there is no evidence that it does, which is true. And I've looked into this. I've looked everywhere. I've had worked with other people. There is no evidence that it does, and there is no known mechanism for how it would harm trans male fertility. What I've heard said, and what my experience has been, is that it certainly stops the ovulation cycle. It stops your cycle. Although, again, not everyone, and some trans men have periods that just persist through their testosterone treatment very stubbornly, and they have to take additional medication, or it's just so. But yeah, almost certainly, even people who do have a period probably aren't ovulating. If you're ovulating, it suggests that your testosterone regimen isn't quite right for your body, kind of thing. But yeah, the testosterone sort of puts your reproductive system to sleep, and then when the testosterone leaves your system, it sort of wakes up again. Like, I know that doesn't sound, obviously that's not how an endocrinologist would put it, probably, but that is my kind of lay understanding. And I've never come across someone who has been told, or I've never heard of a way in which again, like the testosterone itself, once someone stops testosterone, a doctor has been able to sort of look at their situation and say, oh, well, we can see that because you've been on testosterone, this has happened to make it hard for you to conceive. Like, I've just never heard of that. And I've never heard a doctor try and make that argument. What I've, the lack of conversation about it is the problem. And I think, yes, what people encounter is other fertility issues, which they almost certainly wouldn't have had investigated, maybe due to dysphoria or the age at which they started testosterone. Or there is certainly a gray area, or not, everything I'm saying applies to people who have started their transition after puberty. So I think it's more complicated where you have someone, a young person who maybe is on blockers and then starts testosterone straight from blockers, and basically has never goes through a certain stage of puberty where your eggs mature. But again, it's not the headlines that you see about sort of destroying children's fertility, or taking away their futures, this and that. I've spoken to people who know a lot more about this, who say things like, well, if a child is on blockers and then they want to go on to testosterone, we might recommend that they come off the blockers for a few months until there are signs that, or until we can see that their eggs have matured, and then they can start testosterone. So again, it's not nothing, and potentially if they come off, if they stop blockers, if they go from blockers straight onto testosterone, then to come off testosterone, then maybe the eggs mature. I don't know. I don't know anything about that, and I'm not a doctor, but I think that the incredibly black and white and sort of a scaremongering way that this is discussed is so unhelpful and inaccurate. And when I'm talking about eggs maturing, I mean that I think I'm right in saying that usually happens between the ages of sort of like 10 and 14. So the chances of a child in the UK now, especially because of the situation with restricting access to healthcare, the chances of that happening are vanishingly slim, probably zero at this point. It's not something that you have to worry about if you're starting transition as an adult. I would feel fairly confident saying. So yeah.
Legally, having given
Mm.
birth, were you then able to be the father on the birth certificate? What happens about that?
Mm. No, at the moment, the law in this country, sort of family law, has a very narrow definition of mother, and it's all to do with the Birth Deaths Registration Act. It sort of goes back to the 1950s, and the purpose of a birth certificate and all this sort of thing. And it's really complicated, so I'll try not to get too deep into it. But at the moment, the fact that law has never been sort of fully brought up to date to include all the ways in which people can become parents and all the ways in which families exist nowadays. One of the results of that is that trans parents don't have any legal recognition in terms of their children's birth certificates. So the children themselves don't have legal recognition in terms of their parentage, which is an important thing to state, because obviously the focus is often on the parents, but actually we're talking about children here that grow up often without accurate documentation of their origins, including whether donor gametes were used, or surrogates, or anything, stuff like that. So yeah, no, at the moment, if you give birth, then you are by definition legally a mother. And so trans men who give birth cannot be father. They also cannot be parent, because the law in this country defines a parent as the second female parent, so sort of the second mother. But again, because you have to give birth to be considered a mother. If you have a lesbian couple, it's on the birth certificate it says mother, and then either, I don't know, second parent or parent two, or maybe just parent. Um, so a cis man, for instance, cannot go down as parent. A woman that gives birth cannot go down as parent. It's very, very rigid. So in our system, parent is a gendered term because it's for women only. And if you're a man, or if you're a cis man, or, I'm sorry to say, a trans woman, then your only option is to go down as father. So if you're a trans woman, you also cannot go down as parent, because what the government has argued is that gender recognition does not extend to parenthood in any situation, whether you become a parent before you have your gender recognition certificate or after your gender recognition certificate, which I would argue, and many would argue, it was not the intention of the Act when it was passed in 2004. It was not the intention of Parliament. Certainly was not the intention of the people who drafted the Act. But that is the way it's been interpreted more recently in a court case I bought, and then other ones subsequent to that. It's a really, I just find it bizarre because, I mean, obviously I would say that, but if you look at the global context, we are an outlier, to put it mildly, on this front. Many countries, European states, have made it at least so that trans people can go down as parent. In fact, so that any people can go down as parent on birth certificates. The same is true in places like Australia, Canada, US state. I mean, in the US, obviously things are not good in the US right now, but one thing that has always been possible is, sort of flexibility and recognition on this front. Sort of a system that reflects the social reality of the children, as well as the legal gender or sex of parents in general, and doesn't force trans parents to live, for some purposes as one sex and for other purposes as another sex. Something often people will like put to me as some kind of gotcha is like, well, if you're a man under the law, then you're not going to get maternity leave. You're not going to get, or you're not going to get any parental leave, or you're not going to get, any protections from pregnancy under the Equality Act. It's like, well, that's weird. Like, are you saying that we can't update the law? Like, I mean, we've updated the definitions of all sorts of things, including things like marriage and abortion. So the answer to that isn't, oh, well, I better remain a woman then. It's like, the answer is update the law, surely. Like, yeah, I think the conversation in this country has gotten so sort of dire that is considered convincing on some level, or like logical, as opposed to let's update the law to reflect society. Apparently that's now a radical idea. Yeah. I laugh about this stuff because I just have to. Otherwise it would be so depressing, and it's sort of it's definitely a gallows humor type thing.
Freddie, I wanted to ask you, you've been really open about talking about your story and even
Mm.
making the documentary. I mean, what made you decide to do that?
Naivety. um, I mean, like, genuinely, quite a lot of naivety probably back then. Definitely a sense. I mean, I literally was watching, I think, the Edward Snowden documentary. This is quite embarrassing to even admit, but I was working at the Guardian at the time, and we, as a team, in the multimedia department, watched the Edward Snowden documentary, and I sort of was, thinking about what I was planning, and sort of like, well, this is how you change things. You tell your story, you share it, you do it in a accurate, a way that can be backed up, with in a journalistic way, I suppose, in the proper meaning of journalistic. And I will do that because I'm working at the Guardian. And I can do it in a way. I have connections, and we probably, could get some funding. And I knew someone who'd made a documentary that had been Oscar winning. So, I just, I thought this would be a good thing to do. I should do it. And then I didn't realize how hard I would find it to be the subject of a film, as opposed to sort of behind the camera, which is what I was had been sort of doing up until that point, although I'm not a documentary maker, um, more like a sort of video journalist type role. Um, yeah, I thought that it might help, and it did help. It has helped a lot of people, a lot of individuals. I get told that a lot still, even now. Where are we? Sort of 6 years later. So that's amazing, and I'm very proud of it. And I know the team, Jeannie, incredible filmmaker. Her most recent film, Your Fat Friend, is incredible. Is amazing. People should look that up. But yeah, it was things have just changed so much. It was a very different time. We had no idea things were going to get this bad for trans people in this country, and that we'd be looking at things like bathroom bans. And but also, I think it's important to point out that as a trans man, I don't incur anything like the online vitriol and hatred that trans women do, or non-binary people who are assigned male at birth. I just, in fact, what I get is completely ignored, which is ironic if you kind of see the world as so-called gender critical feminists do. So yeah, I haven't sort of suffered in that sense of being attacked, or I even with the film, and even now I occasionally write for the Guardian a comment piece. I had one out last week that I got a lot of positive feedback on, but just absolute silence from the people who I accuse in my piece of being sort of hardline anti-trans lobbyists, things that and say link to articles and put across opinions that I have that presumably they would object to. Just tumbleweed, nothing, which yes is quite frustrating. And okay, especially because at the same time I'll then like go on Instagram and see that a trans woman who I'm friends with is just getting the most vile, dehumanizing comments on some flipping 6-second video she made about, I don't know, a train journey. She'd just be like, it's just yeah. So yeah, obviously, so I've been protected in some ways, but and I'm not asking for that to change like drastically, but I would like to be part of the conversation and included and heard. And I would like someone to have the decency to acknowledge my existence. So I mean people who would have us sort of driven from public life, you know, um, talk to me. Like, are you afraid? Are you embarrassed? Are you ashamed of what you're doing and what you're saying? Does my existence, obviously my existence is inconvenient for your arguments about, you know, um, this so-called safety of women and girls and all that sort of thing. And being a sort of biologically essentialist, or having those views. But surely you can, I don't know, have the confidence in them to like acknowledge that I exist. And I don't want to say debate me, because like I'm not here for sort of two sides journalism and all that sort of thing. But yeah, it's just incredibly noticeable, the silence when it comes to people like me, and except for when they want to sort of use us and cite us in ways that we have no input into. So my court case and my family were sort of implicated in the recent Supreme Court judgment in a way that is very painful and infuriating, to be sort of used against my own community in that way, which I do not recognize the characterization of it, and the sort of like, oh, almost like we need to do it. We need to sort of protect trans men and for their own good. It's incredibly patronizing. And yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Are there things that you learned on your journey that looking back you think, oh, I really wish I'd known that from the start? I'm talking about specifically relating to becoming a parent.
Mm. Well, I wish I hadn't had to go through the process of thinking one thing, that I was going to be sterile, and then by chance seeing a YouTube video with this pregnant trans man in the States, and then going through that whole process of unlearning and understanding the reality. I wish I hadn't had to go through that, and I wish people weren't still going through that. Like I'm part of online groups, and every single week there'll be people posting in this group. Um, I want to cut, I'm on testosterone, but I'd like to have a baby one day. Like people, trans men are more aware that you can have your own babies and you can carry, and that that's physically possible. But it's like, how long should I? I don't want to be on for too long for it to damage my fertility. So how long? And it's like, again, that doesn't matter as far as we're aware. That doesn't make a difference. Just this information still isn't getting out there. So yeah, and I'm trying. We're all trying, but it's very hard without proper sort of funding and systems for making that happen. And the NHS has done some work, but immediately then there's been massive pushback from anti-trans figures and groups whenever we try to do that. And what else? I mean, um, yeah, I suppose I just wish I'd known that it would be okay. Not just that it was possible, but it would be okay, and so that I could have not worried so much while I was trying to get pregnant and then being pregnant and leading up to the birth. Like, a lot well, not unnecessary, because yeah, it would have just been nice to be able to enjoy it and experience it in a more sort of neutral way and make it my own thing and be part of a community of other trans parents of all kinds, or trans people, and and including birthing dads, and um yeah, rather than it all just feeling like a struggle and a sort of potentially dangerous thing, or a maverick thing. Like, none of us are out here wanting to be so-called the first or whatever. Like, we just want like the normal things of sort of safety and community and healthcare, all that sort of thing. Yeah. um yeah.
And in terms of advice for someone else thinking of going through what you've done, what would you have
Mm.
any tips?
um well, maybe just, I wish I could sort of point to a particular source of information. Like I said, there is stuff on it. So there is, yeah, NHS, I think there's like one page, and it is accurate as far as I can tell. Um, if you want to, if you think that you might be able to conceive, and that's something that you're interested in, or you're the parent of a trans boy or child who might be able to carry their own child one day, or might want to look at fertility preservation, don't panic. Like, don't despair. You do have options. You have all the options, probably, and again, unless maybe you've had a hysterectomy. um, so seek out community advice. I mean, be very skeptical of advice that your GP might give you, or even your gender clinic consultant, or specialist. At this point, I think, again, hopefully things are better a little bit, but yeah, just look for that information, because it is out there, and don't feel alone. Don't feel worried, or like what you're doing is unacceptable, or somehow sort of undermines or threatens your identity or who you are. Like, we're you know it's all possible, and it nothing is not you shouldn't feel like anything isn't for you as equally as it is for anyone else. Like, again, regardless of the headlines, just like go after it if that's what you want, because it is extremely possible, and it's wonderful. Like, I could, it's hard. It's incredibly normal ultimately once you get through it, and you're a parent, and you know it's certainly not a what did a walk in the park, but yeah, probably people who want to become parents know that it isn't, right? Yeah, I guess I'm not saying like everyone should become a parent at all. If you don't want to become a parent, that's a great choice as well. I think I understand that more now than I did before I was a parent, like why some people choose not to be. But if you really want it, or if you think you might want it, then you can get it. You can do it. Absolutely nothing. There should be nothing stopping you.
Freddie, thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us today. That was really interesting, and I think everyone will have learned a lot.